Another important topic, of course, is the TCF. So for the next panel, we're going to have Ninon Vagner, who's the Privacy Director of the IAB Europe, take us through the latest updates on the TCF. Ninon, can I ask you to come to the stage, please, and introduce your panel?
I hope everyone can hear me fine. So welcome for this panel discussion on the latest update on the TCF. I'm really happy to welcome TCF experts to discuss this. So we have Stefanie Beckmann, just checking your title again, but Director of Digital Media Ecosystem at Seven.One, also member of the TCF steering group. Christoph Zippel, Senior Legal Counsel at RTL, and also Chair of the TCF Policies Working Group. And last, Julien Delhommeau, so Staff System Architect at Microsoft and also Chair of the Framework Signal Working Group. So really people that are heavily involved in the TCF iteration. Maybe just before we start, because we were actually here last year, and last year it was 3 months, in fact, after the ruling from the Belgian Data Protection Authority, so the APD against IAB Europe and the TCF. We had just submitted our action plan to the APD to propose measures to bring the TCF into compliance with their interpretation of the GDPR. In parallel, we also had filed an appeal, and a lot of things have happened since last year. So the first thing is that our appeal got referred to the European Court of Justice. Second thing is that, surprisingly, the action plan was also validated entirely back in January. And last but not least, we also filed a second appeal against the APD, this time to avoid making changes to the TCF that might be contradicted later on by the European Court of Justice. So there is still lots of legal uncertainty surrounding the future of the TCF. But what we've seen over the past few months is that there was a clear willingness from all sides of the industry to see the TCF evolve, not remain still pending all of this legal proceeding. And there has been a huge amount of work in the TCF working group to, with the objective to really meet the expectation that regulators have or seem to have for our industry. And this is what led to the release of TCF version 2.2 last week. So I'm going to start with Christoph, as chair of the policy working group, maybe to go over the main policy changes to this new version of the TCF.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Ninon. Actually, we changed quite a lot in the policies, and I think it's quite a step towards more transparency and user-friendliness. And I'm just going to briefly go through, I would say, 7 areas of the main changes. The first one is that we've changed legal basis for all purposes that are profiling related. That's like purpose 3, 4, 5, 6. That's the advertising profiling as well as content profiling, and that can only be done under consent under the 2.2 version. We've introduced a new purpose 11, which is more or less an equivalent to purpose 2 that allows use of limited data for content. What we also did is we went through all the names of the purposes and changed that where we found it appropriate or where this was demanded by, or where this was like submitted in the action plan. We also we changed the way that purposes are presented, because prior to 2.2 we had legal text and user-friendly text for purposes. Now it is only user-friendly text where everything is in. So what we also added is mandatory illustrations. That's like 2 per purpose, where real use cases are covered and addressed in, and those can be changed under some circumstances by publishers, but those are mandatory to come with purposes in the future. Furthermore, vendors need to declare with the registration which data they intend to process, what the retention periods are, as well as to provide information for legitimate interests at stake where this is still applicable. Another major change is that users shall in the future have the option to very easily repurpose CMPs to withdraw a consent that has been given, to do that as easily as a consent was given. And another very quite main change is that in future publishers need to provide the number of vendors they are working with on the first layer of the CMP, as well as per purpose, so to give the user an impression on how many vendors might access the data, might process data about a user. So that's the main change. That could go on for hours with all the other things, but I think that's like the 7 main areas where we have made changes.
Yeah, that's it. And maybe now moving to some more the technical specification that support the TCF policies. So what has been exactly like the development process over the past month? Also because it was a fast-tracked iteration this time. Julien?
Yes. So I think one of the big difference for the version 2.2 of the TCF versus prior versions, prior versions were led by business needs. Version 2 of the TCF, for example, was to give back controls to publisher. So we added more purposes to make them more granular. We built in the publisher restriction. So a lot of this was business needs, which means that the technical working group would just take those needs and transform them into technical specs. With the 2.2 version of the TCF, the main difference, as you reminded during the introduction, and as Christoph listed, is all of the changes in TCF 2.2 are policy-led. They're driven by the policy, they're driven by the ruling from the Belgium DPA. So I'd say like one of the big difference for me before versus the prior version is that the technical working group had to work very closely with the policy working group, even closer than we used to in the prior versions. A lot of the work that we've done in the past year was policy working group led by Christoph, looking into the ruling, understanding the impact and consequences, turning them into policies, and then handing over to us to turn those policies into technical specification. So that was one of the big difference. The other thing we had in mind for the past year when making those changes was to try and avoid adding breaking change as much as possible. So we obviously wanted to address the policy needs as best as we could, but when there was 2 possibilities in the design, the tiebreaker eventually was what would bring less friction to the adoption. So one example is, for example, the data retention, which you talked about earlier. So part of the new GVL in TCF 2.2, vendors will now have to disclose the data retention per purposes. Now, there was a couple of ways we could have reflected that in the GVL. We could have changed the form of the current GVL to package both purposes and data retention together, which would have made perfect sense, but that would have been a breaking change. The other design was to just introduce a new data retention field in the GVL, which would be just an additional field, not changing, updating the existing purposes field. And that's the one we decided to go for, because with this approach, we're limiting the friction, we're limiting the work that vendors who mostly care about the purposes definition per vendor need to look into. So that will limit the effort that they will need to make to adjust and adapt to the new version of the TCF.
And like just to follow up on that as well, directly, there was also a lot of effort put into the transition period, like making it as easy as possible, not like between V1 and V2, for example. So what has been like the process?
Sure. So, I mean, I guess the first item is what I just talked about, is we try to limit the breaking changes as much as possible. Obviously, TCF version 1 to version 2 was a full new TCF. Version 2.2 is that's a minor version update. And the reason is because it's a minor technical update to the TCF string itself. There is actually no breaking change in the TCF string itself. There are some breaking changes in the GVL, although most of the changes are just additional fields. So I guess the first thing that we did in order to ease the transition was to try and limit the friction, the breaking change as much as possible. The other thing we did is I guess we learned from the past is we try to give as much time as possible. So the specifications were published last week, mid-May. The timeline for TCF 2.1 string to stop being created will be September 30, so that leaves 4 months and a half. So that's, I think, plenty of time, especially considering that the technical changes behind TCF 2.2 are not that big. Another thing we did also was, I think TCF 2.0 was ending on end of August, basically, which we heard from some market. I guess I'm French, so from French market specifically, July and August is not a great timing for transition. So we made it September 30. We also did not want to go too into the Q4, which we know is critical from a business perspective. And another thing we did also is in version 1 to version 2 transition was on the date of the transition, the TCF1 string are invalid, meaning you have to have not just adopted TCF2, but you also need to have refreshed and reprompted all of your users to get valid TCF 2.2 string because the 1.0 no longer works. So one of the big difference here is TCF 2.1 string, so the current string, will remain valid. There is no expiration date on the TC string. There is an expiration date on creating new TCF 2.1 string, which is September 30. But the good thing, I guess, for publishers with that is they're in full control of when they want to reprompt their users. They could migrate to TCF 2.2 with the help of their CMP and start collecting new TCF 2.2 string starting June 30. They could decide if they wanted to start reprompt their users to refresh the existing 2.1 to 2.2 string. Or they could just decide to have the 2.1 string keep going on. I mean, not create new one, but leave the ones that already exist. And vendors will be able to keep using those. And at some point, publishers have to refresh the user choices, so they have to reprompt the user, right? For example, in France, I think the guidance from the CNIL is 6 months. So every 6 months, regardless of TCF evolution, publishers are, let's say, required to refresh, reprompt users to recollect their choices. So they can keep on that timing here with the TCF 2.2. They can just leave the 2.1 die organically and not force a refresh to 2.2.
Yeah, thank you. This is also something actually we changed as well in the policy, how often publishers should renew users' consent, also because we realized that Data Protection Authority had a completely different guideline from one market to another. Maybe moving to, well, again, like the future of the TCF, and maybe like, because Steffi, so you follow closely like the TCF iteration, but you're also a board member, so you follow the APD case. What are like the key challenges that TCF still needs to overcome?
Well, maybe first I would want to take a step back. Like, what challenges have we actually mastered? Because this is like a big thing to have launched the new 2.2, I think, and what a good thing that we have it now. The challenge is it's a multidimensional and also multi-stakeholder approach. So there are like really diverse interests that have to be covered. Obviously, the regulations and the DPAs, But also within the industry, you have the buy side, the sell side, the vendors, and all of them have different interests, but all of them sit in one room and talk about it. And I come from ProSieben. We own, it's a group of entertainment companies, and I sit on the board and also in the working groups for 20 different companies that are covered with my work. So I have to listen to some things, and sometimes I'm like, ooh, this is good for the publishing part, but then it might be a problem for the vendor. So, and this is just me. I mean, everyone else has like their own interest, and this is like the beauty of it, that IAB takes all these interests, all these people, all these perspectives that are needed to formulate like an operational system everyone can consist on. So at some point at our company, for people that are not introduced to it too well, TCF is like, oh, TCF is a problem. But no, TCF is like the solution. Without TCF, it would be a mess. So the challenge for the future is to keep the speed up, to react on industry trends, but also to put forward like good solutions that are operational, that have like a good lead time, because I was implementing things and lead time is a thing. So I'm always concerned about this. How is like the implementation going? And I think we made like some really good progress in terms of transparency, also to explain, okay, what do you have to do? What is it, what the vendor has to do, or the publisher? So really happy with the outcome. And yeah, it will go on. It will still react. And we heard remarks on new ad formats or the metaverse or things like this. So there's a lot more to cover in the future. It will progress and progress. It's like an agile process.
Yeah, thank you. And while talking about the future of the TCF, because V2.2 is definitely not the last version, I think. What are your prognostics with respect to the next areas of focus, beyond 2.2? What will the policy working group work on, and so on?
Yeah, that's a good question. You never really know what the future brings, but first of all, there's like the upcoming European Court of Justice ruling, and that might determine parts of the TCF. We will see how that goes, and we might need to adopt further parts due to that. But apart from that, there is lots of challenges in the industry. There is deprecation of third-party cookies, which triggers alternative identifiers, which might be needed somewhere within the TCF. There's lots of new cases that have been brought to the policy working group that we haven't discussed yet. We'll discuss in the next months, and there's always new things coming up. I can think that we might need to have some purposes around AI, because especially if you have processing which AI-based or assisted by AI, there needs to be some parts needs to be consent for that. That depends on where the regulation goes. So I guess this is something where we need to look into, apart from what is coming from the European Court of Justice. But I think we will just move on in this policy working group and address the topics as they come in and try to prioritize them. Due to current events, what's happening.
And for you, Julien?
So on the technical side, there are a couple of work streams that we kicked off or will kick off soon. One of them is with regard to the string integrity. So we've been looking into possibilities for the TCF to basically sign the TC string to ensure downstream vendors that receive the TC string from upstream partners that the TC string has not been tampered with, that is remained intact ever since the user made his choices through the CMP. So we've been working actually quite extensively on this also in the past year. There was even some reflection about putting this directly in the 2.2 version, but we've decided that 2.2 should really be focused on the DSA concerns, the policy changes, and so we've decided to hold this project for, as you say, the later version. Another changes that we will start working on soon is just extending the environment, not extending the environment. TCF is environment agnostic, it works everywhere, but we've heard concerns, feedbacks from the industry that, for example, on CTV, it can be more challenging to be using the TCF. Big P or libraries that are provided or standards that have been established are already mobile app design or web design, and they don't really apply for CTV, which means that on CTV, CMPs, publishers, and vendors need to be a bit more imaginative on how they actually implement the TCF. So one of the work streams we want to tackle next is to standardize that CTV environment, to make it clear how the TC string should be generated, but most importantly, how it should be stored and how it should be made available to vendors in a CTV environment, which can be a bit different from a web or mobile app environment.
And one word on the accountability platform as well?
Another thing is with regard to, as well with the integrity, is the accountability platform, which is another project that was kicked off by the Tech Lab in the US. It's not limited to TCF. It's really with regard to any privacy signal around the world. So GPP, for example, in the US, the idea is to provide more transparency on what's happening server-side. For example, today with the TCF, IAB Europe, the managing organization, is doing a lot of auditing on the client side of things. So going to website, making sure that CMP generates TC strings that reflects appropriately the user choices. But it's very hard for IAB Europe or for anyone today to audit what's happening server-side. So how does a vendor process the TC string and what it does with it server-side? The accountability platform is a project that aims at doing that, at providing this transparency on the server side, where vendors will be required to log part of their auctions with a TC string signal and with some information which will help us understand whether or not the TC string was used appropriately. The idea with that, again, is to increase transparency and to let's say, provide more certainty with regard to the use of TCF by others, which eventually is where we want to go. Today, we still need some trust in between the vendors and the publishers. There is obviously policies and everything to guide and pack all of this, but there still needs to be trust. Like, we don't know what's happening, so we need to trust people. With accountability platform, with some of those other projects around integrity, that diminish the need for trust because there is certainty. There is technical certainty that nothing wrong can happen. So those are the upcoming work streams that we've been thinking about on the technical
on the technical side. And you, Steffi, what are your prognostics for the future?
I have one major concern, and this concern is not legal and it's not technology, but it's commercial. Commercial in the sense of we need to make money so we can give out content for free, because I feel that everyone wants content for free. Not everyone wants 5 streaming subscriptions and wants to buy a newspaper and all this. So in order to be able to deliver free content to everyone, there needs to be a commercial model, and the usage of data, like contextual, is a bit of a remedy, but it's not fully covering the cost. So from a commercial point of view, I really hope that we find a system that works for everyone, because I do understand users that fear for their data and need the transparency, but they also need to understand nothing is for free. So if you want free content, you have to give us a solution how to make money with it. Yeah, so this is like one of the things I watch out closely, apart from the legal part, the technology part. And then there's also like another technology part, like the broader scenery, like what happens to the browser? Do we actually get access to the data? Because we may have consent, but then we don't have data. So we can't use consent without the data. So a lot of interesting facts that are coming up. So it will be still a ride, I think.
Yeah,
it will remain interesting.
Yeah, no, interoperability with end-user agent is definitely going to remain a topic that started already. And yeah, users' attention, I mean, when we reviewed the policy, it was really something that we thought about, like, are they going to understand? Does it bring the right information? But at the end of the day, many of them just don't want to spend that much time reading all of the information, and this is really something that the industry actually wants to explain the business model. So again, something where we can made progress towards. Maybe just one last thing to conclude the discussion. So something that came concomitantly to TCF v2.2 is a revamp of the TCF compliance program. So to ensure that participants to the TCF actually respect the policy. What's your opinion on the upgrades that have been made, Christoph, to the TCF compliance program, and does it benefit the industry?
It definitely does, especially for publishers, because publishers are always in the front row when it comes to compliance, and they are the first point of contact for DPAs and for others if there's something wrong. So a compliance program that it gives it gives security for the publishers and reduces legal risks if you know that the vendors you're working with are in compliance with TCF, are in compliance with law, and you know what they are doing. That helps a lot, because as a publisher you cannot always do that yourself, especially smaller publishers can't do that, but they are still liable to the outside. So I think that's a big benefit for the industry as well as for the publisher side.
And Julien, on the vendor side?
Yeah, so I think two things for me. One, to echo what Christoph was saying, this, again, what I was saying earlier about the trust thing, is with this revamp and with the increased audit and compliance program, that will help people know and not just trust that nothing wrong is happening. So that's one. The second thing is, I think that's a very good thing for vendors themselves, because we understand that TCF, GDPR in general, TCF specifically, can be quite large. Small vendors do not have the resources to fully understand and invest into understanding how TCF works, reading through the policies and understanding everything. It can be challenging, especially for small vendors. The compliance program, a lot of it, and along with, for example, the questionnaire, is really just basic. For me, a lot of it is really just basic, step-by-step, like very obvious question and answer if you know a bit around the TCF, which we hope will help vendors that did not have time to invest as much resources to understand TCF, to understand where they may have missed something and make the change to be in compliance. For example, just going through the questionnaire, you will have questions such as, if the TC string does not have consent for a downstream partner, should you send him personal data? The obvious answer is no, you should not. But not everybody knows that, apparently, from my experience. And with this, that would be easy for vendors to understand that they're doing something wrong where they just did not know, and help them understand where they should be focusing attention and making change to make sure that they're in compliance with the TCF and with GDPR eventually.
Thank you. Well, I think we can close the discussion, but I want to thank you, all of you, for being there, for the discussion, but also for the work that you've been doing recently in the different TCF working group. I also encourage everyone to join this working group to really contribute to the work that is being done on TCF, to the different iterations. During these past few months, we also received feedback from national IABs, feedback from participating companies, and we actually resolved the issue that they were bringing to us via the policy working group and the framework signal working group. So any voice is actually always earned, so it's important to contribute. And yeah, please reach out.
Thank you, Ninon.